Hello, folks, and welcome to another episode of Stories, a History of Appalachia. I'm Steve Gilley, along with Rod Mullins. And Rod, today we have a very interesting podcast for folks, one that you actually picked out.
Yes, and it's a very interesting story about Big Jim Hatcher and the death of his wife, Octavia. And we'll talk to you more about that here as it goes on. There's a lot of twists and turns in this story, and it's a very heartbreaking story, but at the same time, it's eerie the way that this story goes. And so we hope that you will sit back and take in the information on this podcast, because to me, putting this together, it was one of the most interesting, I think, podcast stories that I have put together.
Well, all right. Well, let's get into it right now by going over the mountain to Pike County, Kentucky, which is known for a whole lot of things, including at one time during the coal boom being the home of more millionaires in Pikeville and Pike County than overall in the United States. Of course, the Hatfield and McCoy feud took place not too far from Pikeville, and that famous trial involving Randall McCoy and the alleged pig stealing, that was held in Pikeville too. But there's a mysterious story that comes out of eastern Kentucky about the wealthy James Hatcher and the unfortunate events involving his young bride and a specially designed coffin.
Well, Steve, I have to tell you that James Hatcher was born at the mouth of Beaver Creek in Floyd County, Kentucky on September 22nd, 1859. Hatcher was the son of A.J. and Mary C. Lane Hatcher, and he was one of 9 children that was born to this couple. Now, later on when he was younger, he moved to Pikeville and attended school there, and then entered the business world at the age of 18. Now, at that time, Mr. Hatcher opened up a warehouse for merchandise and handled practically all of the merchandise, which was shipped via a steamer to Pikeville, which was the head of navigation for the Big Sandy, which was an extensive district including Pike, Letcher, and Harlan counties, and then that, of course, being in Kentucky, and then Buchanan, Dickinson, and Wise counties in Virginia. Now, he was associated with several other gentlemen, including R.M. Farrell, W.O.B. Ratliff, and John C. Hopkins, in building the steamer called Mountain Girl, which he considered the finest boat on the river, but it was also one of his biggest financial failures of the water.
Among other ventures Mr. Hatcher engaged in was the contracting business, and in 1886 he had the contract to erect the courthouse in Pikeville. A pioneer in the timber industry long before the coming of the railroad and the development of the vast coal fields of the region, Mr. Hatcher floated hundreds of rafts carrying millions of feet of lumber down the Big Sandy to the Ohio, then on to the market points at Cincinnati, Louisville, and Evansville. His early timber operations were successful, and he invested practically all of his profits in land in Pike and Floyd counties until he became recognized as one of the biggest individual landholders in the entire valley.
Well, at Big Shoal, he formerly operated what was called the James Hatcher Coal Company, where his holdings included almost 3,700 acres, and in addition to that was a vast tract of other holdings estimated at 6,000 acres, much of which lies over rich coal deposits. Now, at one time, he was the wealthiest and most renowned citizens of eastern Kentucky, and especially Pikeville, to walk the streets. He was so successful in his business ventures, in fact, he owned property that stretched from Pikeville throughout the outskirts of town to what is known now as Coal Run today.
Well, wealthy as he was, powerful as he was, Hatcher still had fears. Not a fear of losing his fortune, but a fear of something that might be considered trivial to some, morbid to others, but a real possibility, especially in the late 1800s. In 1889, Hatcher was married in Pikeville to Octavia Smith. Hatcher's marriage to the young woman would be cut tragically short after the death of their only son, who died shortly after being born. While some babies have better chances at living after birth today, the infant mortality rate in the 1890s was staggering. If a child survived to the age of 10, it was considered miraculous because of so many factors. While there are inoculations and vaccines today, back in the 1800s there were few vaccines and medications for treatment. That could be one reason why mountain remedies and cures were so depended on then. Young Jacob Hatcher was not so lucky.
Well, the death of Jacob hit Big Jim hard, but not as much as the woman who carried him full term. That death hit Octavia so hard that it put her into a deep depression and illness that would gnaw away at her the very reason for living. In many cases, women took to the bed and slowly died at the heartbreak of losing a child or a loved one. In a short time, she grew weaker and weaker, slipping into a deep coma to which she could not be awakened. On May 2nd, 1891, Octavia Hatcher was pronounced dead of unknown causes. Now, the spring of 1891 was unusually hot in eastern Kentucky, and as embalming was not yet a common practice, no time was wasted as Octavia was memorialized and buried rather quickly to prevent odor and rapid decay.
But in the days following Octavia's hurried funeral and burial, other residents began to get sick and started exhibiting similar symptoms to Octavia's. It was believed to be the bite of a certain fly, now known as the tsetse fly, that had made Octavia sick and caused her untimely death, and now was affecting others in Pikeville. The insect, a native from the mid-continent of Africa near the Sahara Desert, was responsible for sleeping sickness. Now, many who were infected were placed in a comatose state, but later began to awaken after time. Well, you see where we're going with this, right?
Yes, I do.
Hatcher and his family began to worry if Octavia might have succumbed to this illness. You see, Octavia's breathing was so shallow at times, as noted by James and the doctors, that it could have been perceived that she was dead in an actual comatose state for doctors to believe she'd passed. Could Octavia really have been alive and therefore buried alive?
That's a big question there, Steve. You know, how would you feel about doing something like this? You think the person is dead, and now it comes to you and it says, what if they're still alive?
Yeah, that would be one of those greatest fears. Oh my gosh, I buried my loved one, the love of my life, and I might have killed her.
Frantic, as you could imagine, Hatcher secured an emergency exhumation and then uncovered a horrific sight. As Octavia's coffin was raised from the ground, the discovery was made that the casket Octavia had been buried in was not airtight. It was believed that Octavia awakened from her sleep inside the casket to find herself trapped beneath the ground.
Well, piecing the elements together, it was believed that Octavia, in a panic, tore the lining on the lid of her coffin, as it was demonstrated by her fingernails being bloody and her face contorted and twisted from the sheer terror, scratching and clawing and doing everything in her frenzy to escape from her grave. In the end, Octavia was really dead this time. Sadly, James Hatcher never remarried in his remaining time on Earth. In 1931, he opened the showplace hotel, the Hatcher Hotel in Pikeville. He was one of the first innkeepers to display interesting oddities and antiques in a museum-type fashion. He also made sure his guests were secure with superior security and fireproofing, but there was something else on display in the hotel that inspired speculation and legend. And what was that, Rod?
Well, on display, Steve, in the lobby of the hotel was James Hatcher's own casket, which he had had specially crafted years prior to his death. Well, it wasn't just any casket either. This coffin was special. It latched on the inside, and it had to be sealed with a special tool that would then be pulled out when the body was buried. While Hatcher's legend as a businessman had seemed larger than life, he served as a prominent figure in the Democratic political circles in Kentucky and served one term as the clerk of the Pike County Circuit Court, and he was elected state railroad commissioner for the district in 1932. But he died later after a lengthy illness in 1939 after celebrating his 80th birthday at his home located beside the Hatcher Hotel. His final wish was that his funeral be held at the hotel. Many state dignitaries attended the funeral and burial of Big Jim Hatcher, paying their final respects to a true legend of eastern Kentucky.
Now, while no newspaper accounts can be found of Octavia's being buried alive, the legend of the escapable coffin sparked rumor and stories that generate interest to this very day. Perhaps the most interesting legend, though, is the unique monument Hatcher had erected for Octavia and Jacob that sparked another story. He had a life-size, lifelike monument to Octavia erected over the grave. In one arm, the statue held a baby, representative of Jacob. He built the Hatcher Hotel at such an angle that he could look up to the cemetery at his young wife, and she could symbolically look down on him. Well, as time went on, either vandals invaded the Hatcher Cemetery plot and broke the arm holding the baby from the monument, or poor construction resulted in the arm breaking off over time, whichever it was. As of one story, the infant lies on the ground at Jacob's grave near the foot of his mother. But the stories don't stop there.
No, they don't, Steve. In fact, in the 1990s, the remaining Hatcher family erected a fence around the plot in an attempt to keep any curious legend seekers or future vandalism from occurring. The statue was placed on a new marble base so that it would be less accessible. Now, today, there are Pikeville residents who live near the Hatcher plot that report hearing the sounds of a kitten crying coming from the area. Others have said they could hear a woman crying coming from the same area. Now, that kind of goes along, Steve, with the belief of they used to think that young women, especially, it sounded like a cat crying, a teenage girl. Some people have even said that when you hear a cougar or a mountain lion, cougar especially, out in the wilderness, if there are any around, that's what it sounds like. So it could be a variety of different things, but people still stick to this thought that it was either a kitten crying or a woman crying from the same location of the plot. Now, the cries stop when they approach the plot to investigate. But this is funny too, Steve. A photographer taking pictures on a clear day not too long ago at the cemetery captured a mysterious haze around the statue of Octavia. The mist only appeared when the photos were developed, but the most common story concerning Octavia is that on the anniversary of her death, the statue that features her, depicted there at the tomb, will turn away and face the opposite direction.
Wow. Now that's a story, Rod. I'm glad you found that one.
Okay. Thank you.
Now, you can subscribe to the audio version of the Stories podcast in many ways. If you'd like to hear more of our stories, you can go to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Good Pods, Radio Public, Stitcher, Odyssey, Audible, Google Podcast, or iHeartRadio, or whichever podcast app you like best. And until next we meet, well, take care. So long, everybody.